Today we're making focaccia at home. Focaccia is an amazing bread to start your bread making journey with because there are a lot of built-in protections. For example, we're not forced to shape the dough with using any techniques that are more advanced because we're using the pan itself to do that. We're also including a little bit of fat in the form of olive oil, which enables us to have a bit of a more relaxed dough. The high hydration, the nature of it, really makes it an awesome bread to start with. I've been making focaccia for quite some time, and I had this convoluted recipe that required a few days of fermentation in the fridge, but I find myself gravitating much more towards this recipe. That previous version just wasn't practical. This is the perfect recipe to make if you're hosting people the same day. Everybody loves fresh bread, the smell, the taste, of course. It's the perfect thing that comes together in about 4 or 5 hours. What we're going to be doing here is a little bit more advanced. We're going to be freshly milling some grains, which results in a complete unlock, something that is really difficult to replicate with store-bought flour. But that being said, I recognize that I'm talking to quite a niche audience with, with that pitch. So I encourage you to use some bread flour that you'd find at the supermarket. King Arthur makes really good products, and also the Kirkland bread flour is pretty amazing as well. If you're using bread flour, I would encourage you to also get some more interesting grains at the supermarket to mix in maybe up to 20% of your total flour. So we're using 500 grams of flour in this recipe. So if you want to maybe include 100 grams of rye flour or something like that, I think you'll have a really great focaccia as a result of it, with a bit more depth of flavor and some more interesting character. In our case, we're going to be using some hard spring wheat. We're also going to be using some rye, some emmer, and some spelt. So this is going to be a 100% whole grain, freshly milled version. And I think that your results will be even fluffier, and it'll definitely be delicious. So I'll explain as I'm making it some of the differences. But I love milling flour at home. It's something that I only recently started doing. I'm crazy about coffee, and I'll only grind my coffee at home. The idea of using, store-bought tin of pre-ground coffee that might have been sitting on the shelf for 6 months or a year kind of makes me anxious. And the same is true now with flour. Once you taste the difference, it is an amazing thing to be including. The other interesting thing is wheat berries can last for an extremely long period of time at home, like 10 years in some cases under the correct storage conditions. Obviously, I don't keep them that long, but flour goes bad. The oils are leached out, the nutrition sort of starts to get impacted, once you open the package or depending on how long it's been sitting on the shelf. As far as the ingredients go for this recipe, we've already talked about the flour. In addition to the flour, we're gonna also need some water. Water, we're gonna use about 425 grams, which results in an 85% hydrated dough. We're also gonna be incorporating 20 grams of olive oil. We're also gonna be using active dry yeast. You can use instant yeast. If you're using instant yeast, you'll use about 5 grams of instant yeast. We're gonna be using 7 grams of active dry yeast, 10 grams of salt, and we're also going to need a quarter sheet tray. This quarter sheet tray has the dimensions of 9.5 by 13 inches on the outer surface, sort of this top layer here. Milling grains at home is amazing for several reasons, but one of the things that I like the most is that you have complete control over not only the variety, but the percentages of the various grains that you're using in your recipes. I found this mill in upstate New York called Wild Hive Grain Project. It's a father and son duo. The father used to be a beekeeper and a baker, and he realized that it was impossible in the 80s and 90s to find locally grown heirloom grain varieties. So he started working with local farmers to select unique varieties and have them grow grain for him, which he then mills and ships and uses to various restaurants use his product. Today we're going to be using a combination of hard spring wheat. We're going to be using a bit of spelt, some rye, some emmer, and the combination of them just creates this awesome nutty character, deep, rich flavor. Now we're ready to start assembling our dough. So there's a lot of recipes online, or maybe you've heard some information that you need to activate your yeast before you use it in a recipe. That's not really true anymore. Oftentimes it's encouraged if you're concerned that the yeast might be dead or if it's old or expired. But I've never really had any issues with yeast not working. So we're gonna go ahead and add our yeast to our bowl, and we're going to mix in our 425 grams of water. We'll take a rubber spatula and just stir to dissolve. And again, we're not making sure that the yeast is active per se, but we are dissolving it in the water. And this will just ensure that it gets evenly distributed into our dough. The next thing we're going to do is add our flour. The reason we're not adding the salt at this point is twofold. The first is the salt can impact the efficacy of the yeast, and because we want to have the most successful bread possible, we won't create an environment where that's even possible or likely. So we'll go ahead and add the salt after we get some gluten development going. So we're just going to mix the water and our freshly milled flour together until all of the dry bits are fully hydrated. So we've now incorporated the flour and water, and you can see that there's no dry bits remaining. At this point, we're gonna let the gluten start to develop. Gluten develops when two proteins come together, hydrate and link, and those are glutenin and gliadin, something like that. And they will form, and salt will help form that, and also kneading will help form that. But in the meantime, we're gonna allow this dough to sit for about 20 minutes to fully hydrate. And because we're using a larger percentage of freshly milled grains, because we're using some rye in this case, it can tend to get a little bit sticky. And if we allow it to fully hydrate, it's gonna be easier to knead later on. So we're gonna leave this flour and water mixture for about 20 minutes to fully hydrate, and then we'll add the salt and the oil and continue our process. So we are going to cover our bowl. You can use a shower cap if that's something you have. I'm just using saran wrap in this case. And we're going to actually write the time directly on the saran wrap that we are done mixing, so we'll have a better understanding of how the dough is progressing. So it's been about 20 minutes, allowing the flour to completely hydrate with the water that we included. We're now gonna go ahead and add our salt to the bowl. And the salt I'm using here is diamond crystal kosher salt. You can of course use sea salt. The finer the granules, the easier it's gonna be to incorporate into the dough. The next thing you're gonna wanna do is simply wet your hand a little bit and begin working the salt into the dough. We're gonna conduct a series of stretch and folds and then slap and folds, and this is gonna enable us to align the gluten network to begin to strengthen our dough. Again, this is a fairly easy bread recipe, so once we do some initial gluten development, we're actually gonna let most of the process take place in the final pan that we're cooking the bread in. But for now, basically what I'll encourage you to do is take the bottom part of the dough, pick it up, let it flex, and slap it back into place. So what we're doing is we're letting the dough stretch, throwing the dough down, picking it back up, and doing this in a circular motion. So we're building up structure in the dough, aligning the gluten network, and building strength. So I'll do this for about 2 or 3 minutes. You can definitely do this in the bowl of a stand mixer with a dough hook attachment, but I find that it's less cleanup and a bit easier to do it by hand. You can see the dough is already fairly strong, and that's because we did that initial hydration period. And once we add the salt, the dough begins to get a lot stronger as well. So we'll do this for another 30 seconds or a minute. We'll cover this, let it sit for 15 minutes, and do this again. It's been about 10 minutes since we added the salt and did some gluten work, some kneading. We're now gonna do the incorporation of our last ingredient, which is the olive oil. We now wanna pour the olive oil in. Basically, once we incorporate the olive oil, we're gonna continue mixing and ensure that it gets fully hydrated and incorporated into our dough. Sometimes this is a little tricky to do. It feels like it's difficult to incorporate, but just keep kneading it, and I promise it will get incorporated. We'll then continue kneading for another 1 or 2 minutes and cover it back up for another 10 or 15. So we're nearly done with the active part of this recipe. I'm gonna go ahead and remove the saran wrap. It's now been about 40 minutes since we did our initial mix. And you can see that the dough is starting to get bubbly. The only issue is it's not quite as strong as it needs to be. So we're gonna do one more set of kneading, then we'll ball it and put it into our greased quarter sheet tray to do the rest of its proofing. And then from there, we'll do our bake. So as a reminder, I'm gonna wet my hand and do a bit more kneading for about 2 minutes or so until I feel that the dough has gained strength. After our kneading, you can see that the dough has gotten much stronger and it's also developed a bit of a shinier exterior. So we're gonna go ahead and cover this up, let it sit for another 20 or 25 minutes. We'll ball it, put it into our sheet tray, and then allow it to do its proofing. So it's now been about an hour and a half. I kind of just let this proof on the counter. What we're now gonna do is carefully degas the dough a little bit and sort of create a ball. But before I do that, we need to prepare our baking sheet. So again, I placed a small piece of parchment paper in the bottom of here, and that's just gonna help us release the dough once it's finished cooking. And we're gonna put about a tablespoon, maybe a little bit more of oil into the bottom of the pan. At the end of the day, focaccia sort of has this like, almost fried character of the dough at the base, and that's where some of that is gonna come from. So we're now going to take our dough out and sort of create a ball. We're gonna pull from the sides and create a taut surface at the top. And from there, we're just going to place it into our quarter sheet tray. You can move it around, you can flip it upside down to get some oil on the top, but make sure that you place it in there. We're gonna go ahead and cover this back up. It's important that there's a little bit of oil on top so that the saran wrap doesn't stick. And we're gonna go ahead and proof this for about 2 hours. I'm gonna place it into our Breville, which has a proofing setting at about 85 to 90 degrees. And you'll see that it'll get nice and bubbly. Once that process is completed, we're going to punch it down a bit with our fingers, giving it that classic focaccia look, top it with a bit more olive oil, salt, and bake it off. So it's only been an hour proofing, but you can see it has this awesome bubbly sort of dome at the top, which is a really great indicator that it's nearly completed its fermentation. So what we're going to do right now is we're going to wet our hands and we are going to put the dimples into the focaccia, and we are removing a little bit of air during that process, but we're gonna allow it to proof one more time anyway. So we put our dimples in. We're now gonna add another maybe 1.5 teaspoons of olive oil to the top. We're gonna throw it back to proof for another 30 minutes. We'll top it with salt and then we'll bake it. The oven's preheated to 425. We're now gonna take some Maldon flaky salt and just lightly dust the top of the bread. And we will throw it into the oven for about 20 minutes, maybe a little bit more. But you can actually take the internal temperature of bread, and we're shooting for around 200, 205 degrees internal temperature. So we'll see what it looks like after we get there. All right, now's the fun part. Our focaccia has cooled a little bit, but I'm definitely too impatient to allow it to cool as much as it should have. Here's what the cross section looks like. Nice and airy. You can see really great gluten development in the crumb. Let's go ahead and give it a taste. chewy, warm, nutty. It almost has this like maltiness to it. Deep, rich, caramel almost like characteristic. This would be awesome just dipped in some olive oil with some cheese or turned into a sandwich. I can't recommend this recipe anymore. And it came together in what, 4 hours? Something like that. Enjoy. Let me know what you do with your focaccia. Kewpie. Sit.